In the last video, I showed you how resting membrane potentials are developed specifically within neurons. While that video served as a means to provide you the basics as to how the resting membrane potential is developed within neurons and the beginning of discussing how membrane potentials are developed in other cells, it lacked the details that were necessary to understand how membrane potentials could be different between two different cells. For example, how could a muscle cell have a resting membrane potential of -90 millivolts and a neuron have a resting membrane potential of -70 millivolts? Some of this is not even fully understood, but there are plenty of ideas and possibilities of which I'm going to provide you in this video. In the first video, we went over the equilibrium potentials for sodium and potassium as they related to neurons. When it came to potassium, the equilibrium potential for potassium was -94 millivolts, meaning specifically within neurons, if you made the cell only permeable to potassium, potassium would leave through its chemical driving force. That would cause the interior to become negative due to the reduction in positively charged ions and a consequent rise proportionately in negatively charged ions. So this negative electrical driving force would develop, pull the potassium ions backward, and once you got to -94 millivolts, you would hit potassium's equilibrium potential, meaning the chemical driving force for potassium to leave would equal the electrical driving force pulling it back. What I mentioned, but did not have the means to go into detail on in the lecture, is that in some cells, the equilibrium potential for potassium is going to be different. So for example, in another cell, the equilibrium potential for potassium could be -80 millivolts. And that is the first thing that I am going to try and explain in order to provide one of many theories I'm going to go through as to how the resting membrane potential could be different from one cell to the next. The first thing is that there are different equilibrium potentials for specific ions within different cells, and that influences the resting membrane potentials. These numbers I'm about to provide are fictitious, but they are for the purpose of making a point a little bit more simple. So let's pretend the cell on the right is the cell that I was just talking about a minute ago, and also the cell from the resting membrane potential lecture. Let's pretend that there are 1,000 potassium ions on the inside, and on the outside there are 10 potassium ions. All right, so potassium then has a clear chemical driving force to leave, right? There's 10,000 potassium ions on the inside and 10 potassium ions on the outside. So if we put some leak channels into the membrane, then potassium has a very strong chemical driving force to leave. And as it leaves, we know the inside becomes negative. And as the inside becomes more and more negative, it's going to begin to pull potassium ions backwards. Now, what actually determines this equilibrium potential is the concentration gradient. So the greater the concentration gradient is in the case of potassium, the more negative the equilibrium potential would be. The reason for that is, think about it. If there's 1,000 potassium ions on the inside and only 10 on the outside, that is a huge discrepancy of potassium ions on the inside versus the outside. There's a very strong chemical driving force for potassium to leave. And it's going to take a very strong negative electrical driving force to be able to pull potassium ions backwards at the same rate that potassium ions want to leave. Basically, it's going to take a strong negative electrical driving force to equal the very strong chemical driving force. To make the point, let's look at the cell on the left and say that there are only 800 potassium ions on the inside and there's 200 potassium ions on the outside. Okay, so 800 potassium ions on the inside, 200 on the outside. Now, let's embed some leak channels. And initially, the same exact thing is going to happen. Potassium has a strong chemical driving force to leave, right? 800 on the inside, 200 on the outside. So it's going to travel through the leak channels from the inside to the outside. As it does, the inside will become negative. And as the inside becomes more and more negative, that negative electrical driving force is going to begin to pull the potassium ions backwards. And then you have to ask yourself, at what point will potassium reach its equilibrium potential? And this is where the difference comes in. In which example is the chemical driving force stronger? The cell on the right or the cell on the left? The cell on the right has a much stronger chemical driving force than the cell on the left. Right? The diffusion gradient is what a chemical driving force is. Diffusion gradient and chemical driving force are the same. So the chemical driving force for potassium ions within the cell on the right is stronger than the chemical driving force for potassium ions within the cell on the left. So what does that mean for the equilibrium potential? Well, since the diffusion gradient for potassium ions within the cell on the left isn't as large, it's not as strong of a diffusion gradient, it's not as strong as a chemical driving force, the potassium ions still want to leave, but they don't have as strong of a chemical driving force to leave through. So, as they leave and the inside of the cell begins to become negative, not as strong of a negative electrical driving force needs to develop in order to counter the not as strong or weaker chemical driving force that exists within the cell on the left. So you may only need to get to negative 70 millivolts, for example, in order for the electrical driving force within the cell on the left to equal the chemical driving force within the cell on the left for potassium to leave. So at negative 70 millivolts here, the electrical driving force pulling the potassium ions back would equal the chemical driving force for the potassium ions to leave. So the reason that potassium ions within the cell on the left have a more positive equilibrium potential is because of the fact that the concentration gradient between potassium on the inside versus the outside is less. And thus, potassium's chemical driving force within the cell on the left is less. Right? It has less of a drive to leave. So less of an electrical driving force needs to be developed, or a more positive electrical driving force compared to the cell on the right, in order for the electrical driving force to equal the chemical driving force. So this is how potassium could have a different equilibrium potential between two different cells. So for example, within neurons, we know that potassium's equilibrium potential is 94 and negative 94, and that's dictated by what the concentrations of potassium on the inside versus the outside are. But potassium's equilibrium potential in another cell, for example, this cell on the left, let's pretend that that's an epithelial cell or something. Potassium's equilibrium potential in this cell is more positive. And that's all because of the concentration gradient that potassium has within the inside of the cell versus the outside. And this difference in potassium's equilibrium potential is what can make the difference between the resting membrane potential when you compare two cells. So let's do this again. Let's say there's a cell on the right and a cell on the left. The cell on the right has the potassium concentrations on the inside versus the outside that we were discussing. 1,000, potassium ions on the inside, 10 on the outside. So potassium is high on the inside, potassium is low on the outside. Now we're not going to change anything about sodium. Changing sodium's equilibrium potential most certainly could have an influence on the resting membrane potential as well, which I think you'll be able to imagine after this, but we're not going to change anything about sodium. We're just going to do like what we did in the past. We're going to say sodium's high outside, sodium's low inside. And now this cell is going to be just like the other cells that we have discussed. the cell is much more permeable to potassium than it is to sodium. So potassium is going to leave through its chemical driving force at a much greater rate than sodium is going to come in through its chemical driving force. And as more potassium leaves than sodium comes in, the cell is losing more positively charged ions than it's gaining, and the inside is going to become negative. This negative electrical driving force is going to slow down the rate at which potassium can leave, and it's going to increase the rate at which sodium can come in. And when you get to negative 70 millivolts, you reach the resting membrane potential. Potassium has been slowed down so much that it's actually leaving at the same rate that sodium is coming in, which, because of this negative electrical driving force, the rate that sodium is coming in has actually been sped up. And now the membrane potential rests, and the sodium-potassium pumps work to maintain the concentrations of sodium and potassium. Okay, let's compare that to the cell on the left. On the left, there are 800 potassium ions on the inside and 200 on the outside. So same thing that we just looked at a minute ago. And now we're going to do the same thing with sodium. We're going to say sodium hasn't changed at all. We're just going to say sodium's high on the outside, sodium's low on the inside. We won't give specific numbers. Now we play it out, just like we have in the past. There are going to be a higher concentration of potassium leak channels than there are sodium leak channels. Exactly the same compared to the cell on the right. So more potassium will leave than sodium will come in. As more potassium exits than sodium comes in, thanks to the greater concentration of potassium leak channels compared to sodium leak channels, the inside will become negative because it's losing more positively charged ions than it's gaining in positively charged ions. As the inside develops this negative electrical driving force, that's going to begin to pull the potassium ions backwards, right? It's going to counter potassium's chemical driving force to leave. This electrical driving force is going to pull the potassium ions backwards and slow down the rate that potassium can leave. It's going to increase the rate at which sodium can come in. But when do we actually get to the resting membrane potential? And the answer is we may only need to get to negative 40 millivolts before we reach the resting membrane potential. And how could that possibly be? Well, it all deals with potassium's equilibrium potential. Potassium does not have as strong of a drive to move from the inside to the outside in the cell on the left compared to the cell on the right. Basically, and only, its chemical driving force or its diffusion gradient isn't as strong, so it doesn't have as strong of a chemical driving force. Nothing's changed with sodium. Right? So, well, if potassium does not have as strong of a chemical driving force to leave, yet again, you never need as strong of an electrical driving force to counter it. So as the interior of the cell on the left becomes negative, it's going to slow down the rate that potassium is leaving within the cell on the left to a greater degree than the cell on the right, meaning that if both of these cells were at negative 20 millivolts at one point in time, negative 20 millivolts is in the cell on the right is not going to slow down the rate at which potassium is leaving to the same degree as negative 20 millivolts in the cell on the left, right? Because negative 20 millivolts in the cell on the left, the potassium within that cell has less of a chemical driving force, less of a diffusion gradient. So negative 20 millivolts, this negative electrical driving force, is going to have a greater influence on slowing down the rate that potassium can leave through its chemical driving force. It has a weaker chemical driving force, so weaker negative electrical driving forces are going to slow it down to greater degrees than compared to the cell on the right. The cell on the right, potassium has a much stronger chemical driving force, so negative 20 millivolts, that negative electrical driving force, is not going to have as great of an effect. Yes, it's going to slow down the rate that potassium can leave to some degree, but not to the same degree as the cell on the left. So what will ultimately end up happening within the cell on the left is once you get to negative 40 millivolts, that is going to have slowed down the rate at which potassium can leave so much because it has this weaker chemical driving force, this weaker diffusion gradient, concentration gradient, that negative 40 millivolts is going to have slowed down the rate that potassium can leave so much, and so much more than on the cell on the right at negative 40, that at that point, it already equals the rate at which sodium is coming in. So at negative 40 millivolts, the rate at which potassium is leaving equals the rate at which sodium is coming in. Negative 40 was enough to slow down the rate at which potassium is leaving to equal the rate at which sodium is coming in. And this is how the difference in an equilibrium potential can change the resting membrane potential of a cell. As I said in the first resting membrane potential video, the concepts don't change. The concepts for figuring out the resting membrane potential are always the same. You just have to use a little bit more critical thinking skills in applying those concepts to be able to figure out how potentially the differences between resting membrane potentials could exist between two cells. And this is the first one. There could be differences, and there are differences, in the equilibrium potential for particular ions between cells, which has an influence over their resting membrane potentials. So differences in an ion's permeability between two cells is just one reason or one theory as to how two cells could have different resting membrane potentials. The next possibility I'm going to discuss with you is differences in permeability, and that's specifically differences potentially in permeability to potassium and to sodium. If you were to alter the permeability that a cell had to potassium and to sodium, that most certainly would change its resting membrane potential. And I want also to be clear, in this example, we are going to pretend that the two cells have ions, sodium and potassium, that actually have identical equilibrium potentials. So the two cells are going to have identical equilibrium potentials for sodium and potassium, meaning potassium's equilibrium potential we can say is negative 94 like a neuron, and sodium's equilibrium potential is going to be positive 60 millivolts. That's going to be exactly the same between the two cells. And all we're going to do is change the permeability of potassium and sodium, and we can see that that may influence the resting membrane potential.
I think the easiest thing that we can do here is make a comparison. So here's the cell that we've been talking about. This cell has 100 potassium channels for every 1 sodium channel. Okay. What do we know? Potassium will leave at a greater rate than sodium will come in due to those extra channels, and more positively charged ions will be lost than gained. The interior will become negative, eventually reaching negative 70 millivolts, and at that point there will be a strong enough negative electrical driving force so that the rate at which potassium is leaving has been slowed down significantly, and the rate at which sodium is entering has been increased significantly. So we'll actually reach the point at negative 70 where potassium leaves at the same rate that sodium comes in, and we rest at negative 70 millivolts. Okay, this is true for like neurons. Now I just said in skeletal muscle cells, the resting membrane potential is closer to negative 90 millivolts. Exactly why this is, well, we don't know exactly 100% for sure, but one possibility is that the cell is more permeable to potassium and less permeable to sodium than, for example, a neuron. So let's say that the cell has 125 potassium leak channels for every 1 sodium leak channel. Okay, you can make a basic comparison here. You can see, well, this skeletal muscle cell or cardiac, as long as it's a contractile cardiac muscle cell, that's true of them too. It's more permeable to potassium and less permeable to sodium compared to the neuron, the nerve cells. So what's that going to mean? So if we make the skeletal muscle cell more permeable to potassium and less permeable to sodium, 125 potassium leak channels for every 1 sodium leak channel, we're not going to change equilibrium potentials or anything like that. The equilibrium potential for potassium according to the Nernst equation is not going to change. because we haven't changed the concentration of potassium on the inside versus the outside, or sodium on the outside versus the inside. All we've done is changed the permeability. Okay, so what we've done is we've added a lot more doors for potassium to leave through. Rather than having 120 doors per one, rather than having 100 potassium channels for every one sodium channel, there's 125 potassium channels for every one sodium channel. And what that's going to translate into is it's going to just allow potassium to be able to leave at an even greater rate than in the other cell. The rate at which potassium is going to be able to leave is going to be increased. Additionally, to some degree, the rate at which sodium can come in is probably going to be reduced to some degree. Okay, that's what's happening here, right? We've made the cell more permeable to potassium and less permeable to sodium. We're putting more channels, pathways in there for potassium to leave and less pores, channels in there for sodium to come in. To give you, some example, imagine there's 10,000 people inside of an auditorium, and in the first example, there's 100 doors for the people to leave through. Okay, people are not going to be, people are going to be able to leave at a certain rate. I jumped the gun there. They're going to be able to leave at a certain rate if there's 100 doors. If there's 125 doors in the auditorium for people to leave through, imagine people as potassium here. If there's 125 doors now for people to leave through, people are going to be able to leave at a much faster rate than if there was 100 doors. And on the opposite end of that, let's pretend that the people are sodium. Okay, I was giving this as a ratio, which makes it a little bit confusing, but imagine, initially there's 5 doors for the 10,000 people to leave through, right? They're not going to be able to leave very fast. The rate at which 10,000 people are going to be able to leave through 5 doors is very slow. Now imagine that you make 2 doors for 10,000 people to leave through, right? Now they're going to be able to leave the building even slower. It's not a perfect analogy, but that's the basic idea here. If we increase the number of channels for potassium to be able to leave through 125 rather than 100, potassium is going to be able to leave at a greater rate. If we decrease the number of doors for sodium to come in through, sodium is going to come in at a slower rate. So what's the end result of all of this? The end result is, if there are more channels for potassium to be able to leave through, then potassium is going to leave at a greater rate than in this cell compared to, the neuron with the resting membrane potential of -70. And if there are less sodium channels, then sodium is not going to be able to come in at as great of a rate compared to the cell with more sodium leak channels. Okay, again, this cell has a greater concentration of potassium leak channels and a reduced concentration of sodium leak channels. So potassium will be able to leave at an even greater rate, and sodium will come in at a reduced rate. Okay. Well, the cell is still going to become negative as this occurs. It's going to become negative at an even faster rate because, well, positively charged ions are going to be leaving the cell at an even greater rate compared to the number of positively charged ions coming in. So, we're going to get down to -70 millivolts quite quickly. And what's going to have happened at -70 millivolts is the same thing in the last cell, but not as significant of a degree. So when we're at -70 millivolts inside of the cell, because lots of positively charged ions have left the cell compared to the number that have come in, many more potassium ions have left than sodium ions have come in. So we're at -70. That's a decently strong negative electrical driving force that's going to be pulling potassium backwards and pulling sodium inward. But -70 millivolts, that's not going to be a strong enough negative electrical driving force to be pulling potassium backwards at the same rate that sodium is coming in. And that's because of the increased permeability that the cell has for potassium and reduced permeability that the cell has for sodium, right? Negative 70 millivolts isn't going to do it. It's not going to be the point at which potassium's coming backwards, being pulled backwards to such a degree, and sodium's being pulled into such a degree that the rate at which potassium is leaving actually equals the rate at which sodium is coming in. At negative 70 millivolts, more potassium is still going to be leaving than sodium coming in. So what we're going to need to do is develop an even stronger negative electrical driving force in order to be able to reach the point where potassium leaves at the same rate that sodium comes in. So when we're at negative 70, potassium continues to leave at an even greater rate than sodium comes in, and we still continue to become more and more negative until we reach around negative 90 millivolts. Once we reach around negative 90 millivolts, very close to potassium's equilibrium potential, but still not quite there. Once we reach negative 90 millivolts, we have reached the point at which potassium leaves finally at the same rate as sodium comes in. Negative 90 millivolts can finally overcome that extra potassium permeability and reduced sodium permeability. So to create a strong enough negative electrical driving force so that the rate at which potassium leaves now equals the rate at which sodium comes in. So it can really be said both ways. What you'll sometimes hear is that if a cell has an increased permeability to potassium or reduced permeability to sodium, it will have a more negative resting membrane potential. And this is the explanation for why that is the case.
So permeability is another thing which can influence the resting membrane potential of a cell. Right? You could have two cells that have identical concentrations of potassium on the inside and sodium on the outside versus the inside, and they could still have different resting membrane potentials just based upon the permeability that the two cells have to sodium and potassium. And the last possibility or theory that we'll discuss relates to differences in particular ions that may also participate in establishing the resting membrane potential.
What also could have an influence over the membrane potential is if the cell is permeable to chloride. Okay, how permeable one cell is versus another cell to chloride, I would not say is perfectly clear by any means. You can do a basic Google search of this, and you'll find significant varying answers as to the permeability of chloride from one cell to the next. For example, most people agree that neurons have some permeability to chloride, but exactly how permeable to chloride they are, I definitely would not say that there is universal agreement among that. So that's oftentimes why this whole conversation gets left out, because not all of it is completely established. I've given you one table here that shows you, well, we know that chloride is very high in the extracellular fluid and low in the intracellular fluid. This is of a neuron, by the way. And if we look at the permeability of chloride, it's about 0.1, right? And we compare that to sodium. We look at, we know sodium is very high in the extracellular fluid, low in the intracellular fluid, and it has a permeability of 0.05. So this one would imply that chloride is actually a little bit more permeable within the neuron compared to sodium. And then you look at potassium, and of course potassium is the most permeable, right? It's very low in the extracellular fluid, high in the intracellular fluid, and has a permeability of 1, right? So potassium is incredibly permeable compared to any other ion. And we just won't even include calcium at this point because, well, calcium is, again, pretty much universally agreed upon that there's almost no permeability that a neuron and most cells have to calcium. unless we open up the gated channels for calcium, in which case it could come in, but that's not part of the conversation right now. So what am I showing you here? I'm trying to demonstrate the fact that some cells have permeability to chloride, and that's going to influence their resting membrane potential. How much it influences the resting membrane potential is going to that's going to be determined by how permeable it is. And I can't give you an answer, honestly, as to how permeable one cell is versus another to chloride, because again, I don't think that has been fully established. But what I can do is show you what effect chloride permeability would have on the resting membrane potential.
So we don't have to say exactly which cell this is. We're just going to say that this is a cell that would have a resting membrane potential of negative 70 millivolts, like we've been looking at. But now we're going to say that we're going to add chloride into the equation all of a sudden. We're going to see what happens. So what we said is the cell that we've been discussing, it had 100 potassium leak channels for every 1 sodium leak channel. That's really not the way that we can think about this. It's going to have to be the number of ions that are coming in and out comparatively to one another. So let's do it this way. Let's say that over the whatever amount of time is happening, when their resting membrane potential is developing. First, there are 100 potassium ions leaving over the course of a couple milliseconds. I don't know. And over that exact same amount of time, there are 10 sodium ions coming in through the few leak channels that they have. So the cell is losing, for whatever amount of time this is, half a second, the cell is losing approximately 90 positively charged ions over that period of time, because 100 positively charged potassium ions are leaving for every 10 positively charged sodium ions that are coming in. And that's making the interior negative. And as the interior becomes negative, the rate at which potassium can leave is reduced and reduced and reduced. And let's say that it gets reduced all the way down to 20 when we approach negative 70 millivolts. And at negative 70 millivolts, we've increased the rate at which sodium is coming in so that 20 sodium ions are coming in. So now, at negative 70 millivolts, 20 potassium ions are leaving over this half-second time period, however long it is, and 20 sodium ions are also coming in over that period of time. So just as much potassium is leaving as sodium is entering. So we rest at negative 70 millivolts. But now we're going to look at this exact same cell and pretend that it has some permeability to chloride. So to start off with, what we're going to say is that, again, 100 potassium ions are leaving over this period of time through these leak channels. We know that 10 sodium ions are coming in through these leak channels as the membrane potential is developing. And now we're going to have some chloride leak channels. What do we know about chloride? Chloride is a negative ion, and it's higher on the outside than it is on the inside of a cell. So if the cell has no charge to start off with, right, it has just as many positive and negatively charged ions on the inside, then, has just as many positive and negatively charged ions on the inside, there's no charge to start whatsoever. Right? This is development of the cell's membrane potential. So chloride, since it's a negative ion, it has a high concentration outside and a low concentration inside. If we put leak channels in the membrane, chloride's going to come in, plain and simple. And we're going to say over this same exact period of time that 20 chloride ions are going to come in. So now we have some extra math to do. Over this period of time, 10 positively charged over this period of time, 100 positively charged potassium ions are leaving, and 10 positively charged sodium ions are coming in. That would mean a net loss of 90 positively charged ions, which would make the proportion of negatively charged ions on the inside rise. But over that exact same period of time, an additional 20 chloride ions are entering through these leak channels because this cell has some chloride permeability, and that means the cell is gaining 20 negatively charged ions. So not only is the cell, over this period of time, losing 90 positively charged ions, which is making it negative, but it's also gaining an additional 20 negatively charged ions. So there's a loss of 90 positively charged ions and an addition of 20 negatively charged ions. So as a whole, after this period of time is up, there would be an additional, compared to positively charged ions, 110 negatively charged ions than when we started, right? Because 90 positively charged ions were lost. That means proportionally the number of negatively charged ions in the cell rose by 90 compared to positive. And then an additional 20 negatively charged ions came in, so the cell gained 20 negatively charged ions. So we have to add that. And with the loss of 90 positively charged ions and the addition of 20 negatively charged ions, that's actually going to result in a total increase in negative to positive, an increase of 110 negatively charged ions compared to positively charged ions. So with this chloride coming in, the cell is, all that's really going to happen initially is the cell's just going to become negative even faster. Nothing is going to happen that's different really so far, other than the fact that the speed at which the interior of the cell becomes negative is going to accelerate. Because the cell is not only just losing positively charged ions, it's also gaining negatively charged ions. So that's coupling, and it's making the interior negative even more quickly. And the same would be true for the outside in the sense that it would be becoming positive more quickly. And what effect would this have? You'd have this negative electrical driving force developing on the inside and a positive electrical driving force developing on the outside. First of all, what would the negative electrical driving force do? Everything that we already know. It would slow down the rate that potassium is leaving, and it would increase the rate at which sodium is coming in. But what would the negative electrical driving force have on chloride? The negative electrical driving force would have, visually at first nothing, but if the outside is becoming positive, that would begin to pull chloride backwards, right? So as the inside becomes negative and the outside becomes positive, there's a positive electrical driving force developing on the outside, pulling those chloride ions backwards. So basically, as the cell becomes more negative, here's what's going to happen. The rate at which potassium leaves is going to decrease. The rate at which sodium enters is going to increase, and the rate at which chloride enters is going to decrease. The chloride ions entering are going to decrease because the outside is becoming more positive and it's pulling the chloride ions back. So now we can just get to the question of what would happen when the interior hits negative 70. So we can just go to our original example and say, well, at negative 70 millivolts, we know a couple things are true based upon the first example. At negative 70 millivolts, 20 positively charged potassium ions would be leaving. And at negative 70 millivolts, 20 positively charged sodium ions would be entering. So you would think, well, okay, that the resting membrane potential then must be established because just as much potassium is leaving as sodium is entering. And the answer would, in fact, be wrong. Because while it's true that the outside would be rather positive at this point and it would be pulling chloride backwards, we're going to say that not all of those chloride ions are being pulled back. What I'm saying is chloride would not be at its equilibrium potential just yet. If the inside is negative 70 and the outside is positive, positive 70 approximately, that would be having a strong electrical driving force pulling chloride ions backwards. But we're going to say that this electrical driving force, positive electrical driving force, pulling the chloride ions backwards, is actually still not as strong as the chemical driving force that chloride has to enter. So still, even now, let's just say that there are still 5 chloride ions entering over this period of time. So however long this period of time is, 20 potassium ions are leaving for every 20 sodium ions coming in. So just as many positively charged ions are leaving as positively charged ions are entering. But wait, that's actually not true because there's 5 negatively charged chloride ions that are entering, and those 5 negatively charged chloride ions will cancel out 5 of the positively charged sodium ions. So in reality, you can think about this as almost as if there were 15 sodium ions entering. Really, the best way to think about this would be like there's 15 positively charged ions entering into the cell over this period of time. There's technically 20, but 5 of them are being canceled out by the negatively charged chloride ions. So really, 15 positively charged ions are entering the cell over time compared to 20 that are leaving. And thus, what's going to happen? The interior is going to continue to become more negative. We're not going to rest at negative 70 millivolts because at negative 70 millivolts, the same number of positively charged ions are actually not leaving in terms of net gain as positively charged ions are entering. Right? There's more positively charged ions leaving than there are entering because 5 of those negatively charged chloride ions are canceling out 5 of the positively charged sodium ions, so only 15 are coming in. So over this period of time, the cell is in fact losing 5 positively charged sodium ions over that period of time because 20 positively charged ions are leaving for every 15 coming in. That means more positively charged ions are being lost, and the proportion of negatively charged ions on the inside is going to continue to rise. So the inside is going to keep becoming more negative. And let's say that it goes down all the way to negative 80 millivolts. And it may take going all the way down to negative 80 millivolts in order to reach the true resting membrane potential. But even then, why would that be the resting membrane potential at negative 80? Because by the time that we get to negative 80, what effect would that have? It's going to do a variety of things. At negative 80, now the inside has an even stronger negative electrical driving force. That's going to pull potassium ions backwards to an even greater degree. And it's going to pull the sodium ions in to an even greater degree. So let's say this. Let's say at negative 80, now there's only 18 of these potassium ions leaving over this period of time, right? Because the greater negative electrical driving force is pulling more potassium ions backwards and further decreasing the rate at which potassium can leave. And additionally, it would be pulling sodium ions in to an even greater degree, this strong negative electrical driving force. That would, let's say, increase the number of positively charged sodium ions coming in over that time to 21. Okay? So now, on the surface, what does it look like? It looks as if for every 18 positively charged potassium ions leaving, there's 21 positively charged sodium ions entering, which should mean that the cell is gaining 3 positively charged ions, which actually should be making it more positive, but it doesn't. Because as the interior became more negative and it reached negative 80 millivolts, the outside would have reached positive 80 millivolts. And that would have further decreased the rate at which chloride could enter. And let's say that it decreased the rate at which chloride could enter to 3 chloride ions rather than 5, right? The outside became more positive, so a stronger positive electrical driving force developed, pulling the chloride ions backwards to an even greater degree. And Now, only 3 chloride ions are entering versus 5 last time at -70. So let's do all the math here. You say, okay, there are 18 positively charged potassium ions leaving over this period of time for every 21 positively charged sodium ions entering. That looks like the cell should be gaining 3 positively charged ions over that time. But it's not, because 3 negatively charged chloride ions are still entering and canceling out those 3 positively charged sodium ions. So really, you could think about this as if 18 positively charged sodium ions are entering, right? Because technically there's 21, but since 3 negatively charged chloride ions are entering, those 3 negatively charged chloride ions are canceling out 3 of the positively charged sodium ions. So really it's 18 positively charged sodium ions entering. So if we really look at this at -80 millivolts, this is the resting membrane potential. This is when the cell is losing just as many positively charged ions as it is gaining, at least in terms of a net value. It's losing just as much positively charged potassium ions as it's gaining in positively charged sodium ions when you cancel out the sodium ions that don't count because of chloride entering. So this is how, when you factor something like chloride into the equation, the resting membrane potential can change as well. When you factor other ions in, other ions influence the cell and can change what the resting membrane potential is. Generally speaking, chloride makes the resting membrane potential of cells more negative. Because if chloride is entering, then what you would think would typically be the resting membrane potential can't be, because if potassium and sodium are leaving and coming into the cell at the exact same rate, and then you have chloride entering too, those are additional negatively charged ions, and they're going to cancel out some of the sodium ions that are coming in. So technically, more positively charged ions are still leaving at a greater rate than positively charged ions are entering. And the interior has to become more negative in order to actually get to the resting membrane potential. So now I hope you can see how many factors can actually influence the resting membrane potential. Right? This is why cells can have different resting membrane potentials. There certainly can be differences of equilibrium potentials of the same ion between two cells. You can have differences in permeability for particular ions between two cells. And you can have other ions that participate in establishing the resting membrane potential, or you can have a combination of all of these things influencing the resting membrane potential. And that's why understanding resting membrane potentials is so difficult, and why we don't have perfect explanations as to exactly why the resting membrane potential of a particular cell is what it is, because we don't know all of these different factors necessarily that are influencing its resting membrane potential. We don't know which one of these is contributing the most and why, and some of those things are actively being studied as we speak. But I hope now you can see why I was not able to cover this in the first video. Because while it applies all of the exact same concepts from the first video about the resting membrane potential, the conversation is just a little bit too advanced to discuss without having that prerequisite knowledge from the first video right off of the bat. You really need to know that initial knowledge relating to equilibrium potentials and how a basic resting membrane potential is established to be able to discuss these concepts. If there are other videos that you would like to see related to this or to other topics, as always, please let me know.